All right, good morning. Thank you, everyone. My name is Robert Barron. In my day job, I'm a program officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington. I also previously worked here at the Baker Institute for Ambassador Djerejian, so it's really an honor to be here and be up on the panel and sitting with a number of friends and colleagues that I haven't seen in quite a while. And I'll just, again, congratulate Ambassador Djerejian on 28 years of building this incredible institution. And we're very, it's a long time, it's a big effort. It was a team effort, you and Francoise, but it's really just been an honor to be a part of it. So this panel today is going to be on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the slide toward a post-two-state reality. As I'm sure most folks in this room would know, there have not been negotiations since 2014. Every year, month, day, it seems that things are getting a little bit more difficult towards reaching a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We see violence break out, settlement expansion, weakening institutions, hardening attitudes, and there's a real sense, part of my job is talking with Israelis and Palestinians, and the default in the zeitgeist today is really that the two-state solution is dead or dying, and it's even put into policy. Scholar Brookings Natan Sachs said that the Israeli policy is generally anti-solutionism, that there is no solution, and that has to be the sort of default. And so there is no clear shared political horizon between the two parties. The two would not agree that the two states for two peoples model is what we're working towards, and they're not working towards it. So there's a sense that there could ever be to use Gilad's term, a divorce, is no longer possible, that we're talking about negotiating some kind of shared cohabitation or something like that. But how do you negotiate individual and collective rights in that model? How do you divide the powers and rights of peoples and identity groups in an integrated land? And so the polling is there. I won't get into it because I think we're running a little bit late, but when you poll Israelis and Palestinians, the sense that the two-state solution is possible or feasible or desirable is lower than it has been in a long time. But it remains a very important question. We see outbreaks of violence very regularly. Diplomacy is stagnant, but to use Ambassador Djerejian's term again, is the status quo isn't static. Things are getting more difficult by the day. So one of a colleague says, we're constantly living on the edge of a volcano, and as the violence of the past year has kind of demonstrated, we're constantly on the edge of something much worse. So I'm going to ask, we've got 4 great panelists here, and I'm going to ask each of them to speak for about 8 minutes on a specific set of questions that I've given them. I wanted to start by sort of laying out some definitions so we could all kind of agree on a shared language. The two-state solution has traditionally been understood: two sovereign independent states on the 1967 lines, West Bank and Gaza as the state of the Palestinians, East Jerusalem is the capital. Those 67 lines come with land swaps, but these are often referred to as the Clinton parameters. Another term that's come up more and more is one binational equal rights state, and that's from the Jordan River to the sea. It is a state of all its people with equal rights for all. This does not accomplish the nation-state goals for either party. One unequal state, there's different ways to think about this that we may or may not get into, but you could think about it from status quo to, and again, an apartheid state, to Palestinian municipalities and individual rights without collective rights. And then finally, confederation, which Omar will speak to a little bit. But again, this is, think Canada or Switzerland. It's an attempt to define certain areas of national sovereignty and certain areas of shared sovereignty. So in this panel, we're going to talk about where we are today, where things are going, how we got here. And we'll do each of the panelists speaking to a specific set of points. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. You have the biographies on your tables, so I won't get into very deep bios, but suffice it to say, these are all terrifically impressive colleagues, and I thank them for being here. We have Gilad Sher, who's the Isaac and Mildred Bronstein Fellow in Middle East Peace and Security at the Djerejian Center for the Middle East at the Baker Institute. Samih Al-Abed is the Sabah Fellow in Middle Eastern Studies, where he focuses on conflict resolution here at the Baker Institute. Omar Rahman is a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs and Laura Friedman is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. So to get started, Gilad will start us off. Gilad, your new book, Reflections on Conflict Resolution, I'm reading off the back here, offers hope that there may be ways to resolve or at least mitigate complex, violent, and protracted conflicts between communities and nations. Why are those proclaiming the death of the two-state solution wrong? Can we reflect on how we got to this current moment and what we need to do going forward? Gilad.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Ed, for organizing this, Ed and the team, and for inviting me. I'm pretty sure that the two-state solution is not over. And Robert, you were right in saying that there's a growing sense that the two-state for two people is, the paradigm is probably lost. It's like an old sweater that you stuck deep in the closet. You're not supposed to wear anymore. Nevertheless, I would say that this solution is still very valid, and I'll explain why. The current Israeli government believes that only shrinking the conflict, so to speak, is possible, and of course there's growing divides between the Palestinians, Gaza, West Bank, Hamas, Fatah, political factions, institutions, and the people. There's no shared political vision or political horizon between the parties. There's zero trust or close to zero trust. But the status quo provides no security, and it offers no hope. It undermines both parties' long-term national interests, and the status quo leads to a one-state solution, which I believe would be disastrous for both parties. The main spoilers are leadership, security, and public opinion. But I would like to explain why the two-state solution, despite the challenges that are inherent in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is the only possible way to secure a Jewish democratic Israel consistent with the Zionist vision, and at the same time provide political self-determination for the Palestinians. We heard in the previous panel how significant was the formalization of the Israeli-Arab normalization. I recap on Intisar what you said about the Morocco-Israel relationship. It all culminated in mid-2020 in the Abraham Accords and reinforced since then. But the core contentious issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Jerusalem and the holy sites, territory, borders, settlements, security arrangements, and refugees will not disappear just because someone has said that they are off the table or they're on a back burner or whatever. I see no solid alternative to the two-state solution. An institute I've been working with in the last decade, the INSS, Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, scrutinized on an annual basis all the alternatives, the plans, initiatives, ideas, and every time, according to about a dozen parameters, the two-state solution came up as the only valid solution. The question is how to get there. If that is the case, is it still attainable? I say yes. It is still attainable throughout a constructive unilateralism approach. We need to lower the bar of expectations, not a full-fledged comprehensive agreement that resolves all the core issues and ends the conflict and put a finality to all claims, but a more achievable, modest level, a series of transitional and interim phases, independent steps, all compliant with continuous binding negotiations. We have to redesign the process. We need to redesign the framework in a modular fashion, and not in a one-of agreement. And the gist of the matter is to preserve the conditions for an eventual two-state solution that would come up sometime in the future, and not negate the possibility of having such a solution put together at a certain point in time in the future. I cannot overemphasize the importance of it, but here's how I suggest moving forward. First, I think that we need to discard the exclusive bilateral Israeli-Palestinian negotiation framework. As you know, and as you pointed out, Robert, in the last 8 years, there was no negotiation whatsoever. And in the last 30 years, there were only 2.5 serious rounds of negotiations around Camp David and Taba in the late 90s, beginning of the 2000 years, and then the Annapolis process in 2007, 2008, and then last round, half a round, I would say, in 2013 and 14. Accumulate altogether in 30 years since the Madrid conference, we've negotiated perhaps just a little bit less than 10% of the time we negotiated permanent status. And for such a protracted conflict, this is not enough. I think that we need to add a regional context to the talks, creating by that a Western Sunni possible axis. We need to have international involvement because we're like in a kindergarten. We cannot talk to one another anymore without someone imposing on us a process, not a solution, but a process of negotiations. We can use the Arab Peace Initiative as a general ballpark with all the reservations and observations that Israel has on it, and we need to update it. And we need to replace the formula of nothing is agreed until everything is agreed by a new formula. Whatever is agreed or mutually coordinated should be immediately implemented. We need to encourage, even to incentivize, the two sides to take constructive, independent steps towards disengaging from one another and creating a reality of two states, even in the absence of a political agreement at that point in time. The changes and the modification of the situation on the ground in themselves will help those negotiations. We have to advance gradually towards delineating a border between the two nation states, a future distinct national entities that would be sovereign two states, one beside the other, and we have to add security and, of course, economy components to the transition phases. What to do about Gaza? A big question that always comes up. I think it is crucial to mobilize international efforts in every way possible to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. We have to rehabilitate infrastructures in exchange for the establishment of a mechanism that will act to stopping the military buildup of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other terrorist groups and Salafist and other violent groups. I believe that, to make it a short introduction to the deliberations of afterwards, I believe that a step-by-step approach is realistic. I believe that it stands a chance to succeeding. If it does, it would make Israel the Jewish democracy it is set out to be, and it would provide freedom and statehood for the Palestinians. Otherwise, with no political horizon, with no hope, we are bound to proceed with an intractable conflict, distress, frustration, indifference to one another. And what are the game changers here, except for what I suggested, the gradual approach and the three-pronged one, international, regional, and bilateral, encouraged by also constructive independent steps. The game changers are, I think, the youth, the young generation, the civil societies, the social networks, We are only 14 million people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. That's, I believe, less than Houston metropolitan. Not less, but not quite over that. 14 million people, I can reach out from my smartphone, each one of them, and carve out a change of mindsets towards a more peaceful coexistence. We have other issues that are not really sensitive to borders: climate change, environment, energy, desertification, whatever, just name it. And we can use that as well. The old generations, like my friend Samih Al-Abid here and myself, we start to become redundant or almost irrelevant because, in the absence of leadership, if you put Samih and myself in a room for 3 days, we get out with an agreement, but it's worth nothing. A permanent status agreement. Am I right or not? Okay. And I'd like to end this brief introduction by quoting Menachem Begin, our late Prime Minister, who said to President Sadat in November 1977, just 4 years after the harshest war that Israel and Egypt had ever, the Yom Kippur War, he said, and I quote, "We have learned from history that war is avoidable. It is peace that is inevitable." Thank you.
Thank you, Gilad. So I'm now going to turn to the other Baker Institute fellow, Samih Al-Abid, with some similar questions. So why are those proclaiming the death of the two-state solution wrong? You're a committed two-stater, continue to be, I think. Walk us through how we can get back to that place. And I want to pick up on a few of the things that Gilad mentioned. So faith in youth has been a theme of this conflict for a long time, that the next generation will solve this, but that's not actually, I think, what we're seeing. I think when you do the polling of both Palestinian and Israelis, that there is a real sense of despair, there's a real sense of hardline attitudes and a lack of willingness to compromise. So I'm interested in what your feeling is about where Palestinian youth are, the place for the region. So Gilad mentioned that we need to bring in regional actors and other longtime, let's say, partners to the Palestinian cause and from the Gulf or elsewhere in the region. What role do you see the region playing? And independent steps. So Gilad mentioned independent steps that the Israelis can take. Obviously, it's a little bit different in terms of the power and the capacity to move on the Palestinian side, but what are independent steps that the Palestinians can take? In 8 minutes.
Thank you very much for inviting me here, and Ed, thank you for having us again here to talk about this important session about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which has taken more than enough time to be solved, which is creating a lot of problems, not only for both of us, but in the region as a whole. Why the two-state solution is important for the Palestinians? Because it provides international recognition of the state of Palestine, living side by side with the state of Israel in peace and prosperity. Palestinians insist on a sovereign and independent Palestinian state with the right of self-determination, a state with clear borders that is viable, contiguous, and shares international relations with all countries in the region and beyond, including the state of Israel. The vision for the state of Palestine is based on fundamental human rights of freedom, dignity, and equality, and is in line with the international law and the system of justice and accountability that the international legal order is designed to preserve. Moreover, an agreement on a two-state solution would lead to reconciliation among Palestinian factions, which would need to work together under the new unified government. This would also lead to security for the state of Israel and the region. Having said that, of course, we know that from two-state solution to one-state solution to the deal of the century to shrinking the conflict, and many issues that are running away from the fact to accomplish the two-state solution. The fact on the ground, what the Israeli government is doing by building more settlements, confiscating more land, destruction of homes, and all the action that is taking place is really harming the two-state solution, and it tells us that the government of Israel have no intention whatsoever in having a two-state solution. The status quo for them is relaxing. They are confiscating land. They use 61% of the area of the West Bank under their control, and now they control everything in the West Bank. Not only 61%, but all the area in the West Bank. Now, in order to preserve the two-state solution, that there are certain actions that need to be taken from the Israeli side and from the international community, and mainly from the American administration. Because the American administration, they were the gavel holder of the peace process since it's initiated in 1994, 1993. But so far, what we've seen from the administration is, I can say that not only they were not holding Israel accountable of what they're doing there, but the continuation of the settlements there without stopping that and creating the atmosphere toward the people of Palestine and the Israelis to live together in a two-state solution became more harder than before. The young generation, as you said, that they changed their mood according to what is happening on the ground. One day for two-state solution, one day they are for one-state solution, and then when they see the reality on the ground, they came back and they said, according to new polls, saying that 40% of the people in the West Bank believe that the two-state solution is the only viable solution for that. What about the 60%? It's divided among different things, but those are the majority that they believe that the two-state solution is the only solution that we need to take place. Then there is a burden on the international community and in the American administration as well. The last administration came with a new, the deal of the century, which is really harming the Palestinians instead of creating any positive hope for the establishment of the two-state solution. And the new administration here in the state, when they came, they promised us that they are for the two-state solution. And they went to have reopen the Council General in Jerusalem. And they want to enhance the Palestinian Authority and to provide some way of getting together between the Israelis and the Palestinians to meet and to talk about peace. None of this happened till now. And the reason for this, they tell us that at the beginning, wait and see, maybe this Israeli government need to pass the budget, and after they pass the budget, we can talk more seriously about it. Then after they pass the budget, they said, it's a fragile kind of government. You have to wait and see how we can deal with them. But at the same time, they are continuing building settlements, continuing moving here and there, doing whatever their usual business there. And then in addition to that, we came to a new Abraham Accord, okay, that is avoiding the Arab Peace Initiative, which I agree with Gilad that we have to come back to the Arab Peace Initiative because that was one element that create positively toward make peace, not only between Palestinians and Israelis, but between Israel and the whole Arab countries and Islamic countries as a whole. So the Abraham Accord came, and partially they avoid the issue of the Palestinian people. agree with what you said about the Moroccan relationship with Israel. It has been since before 1994. The relationship was there. The only new elements of this is the UAE as well as the Bahrainis and the Sudanese. I don't know what was the thinking behind it. But if you look at the map behind us here, you can see where the UAE and Bahrain, it's in the Arabian Sea, and in the Virgin Sea, some they like to say that. So it's only a military issue that they want to be present there. And if you look Sudan in the Dead Sea, around you here, it's only the presence of the military establishment of the Israelis to be there. So we'll have more control on this. We are in the front door of Israel. So it is making peace with us is more important than to make peace with others, because we are in the front yard. And we believe that we can be the best neighbors for the state of Israel if we have the state of Palestine. In relation to, we admit that the Abraham Accord is there, okay? But how we can utilize this as part of the Arab Peace Initiative that will become more benefit for both of us in order to help and support the establishment of the two-state solution. The other issue that Gilad mentioned as well, that between the Mediterranean and the Jordan Valley, according to the Israeli statistic, there are 7 million Jews living there, and for Palestinians in the area is 7.4 million. This is now. So if you look at demographically in the year 2030, which is next door, the demographic create a different type of problems. So it is better for all of us to start to think seriously how to achieve the two-state solution before things running out of hand from both sides. How to do that? There are two steps that, in my mind, that we can establish. One, how to preserve the two-state solution, which means we need to create the infrastructure needed for the establishment of the state of Palestine and the West Bank. And the second one is the recognition of the state of Palestine from Israel and from the UN Security Council. The recognition of the state of Palestine now will create or solve many of the problems that dealing about the conciliation, dealing about other issues there, because the state, when you recognize the state of Palestine, they have to act as a state, and there will be no more factions of the PLO. There will be political parties that they will present the interest of the people, and there will be no more Hamas and Jihad and other issues, because they have to be part of the state, which goes alongside with the international community, with their laws, rules, and regulation. They have to abide by this if you have a state. Then the magic word is how to recognize the state of Palestine in order to avoid all this. The recognition of the state of Palestine, at the same time, are working in how to preserve the two-state solution will be the real model to go ahead in order to accomplish the two-state solution.
Thank you, Sami. A lot to pick up on there. So next, I'm going to go to Omar Rahman and Lara Friedman for responses and additional thoughts. But Omar, as I mentioned the Confederation model earlier. He's been researching the Confederation model, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that. But Omar, I'm interested in your response to everything that's been said so far, whether a two-state solution is possible and how this came to be. And then, again, getting into this concept of alternative solutions and what that may look like. Omar.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for inviting me to speak on this distinguished panel here, and congratulations to you, Mr. Ambassador, for your long and distinguished tenure at this center, and I'm sure you'll be missed. I'm going to start with why I think two states is no longer viable, and then move on to the Confederation model. So a lot of ground to cover in 8 minutes. I'll do my best. First, I think when you're talking about this issue, you really need to grasp the magnitude of what we're talking about when you're talking about implementing a two-state solution. And then you have to apply that to the socio-political context that exists and ask yourself, does it support this? Is it possible? And I think what we're talking about here is dismantling a state-sponsored enterprise in occupied territory that's gone on for 54 years. That means uprooting hundreds of thousands of settlers, creating a Palestinian state. And these are settlers as well that are citizens, that vote, that organize, and that resist, and that have wield a tremendous amount of political influence in Israel itself. And to be honest, have become, I think, the most influential over the political agenda in the country. But when we look at the composition of Israeli politics today, to make those kinds of changes in that kind of magnitude, and again, I think it would be a profound undertaking. That sort of direction, I think, is impossible. Israel's far closer today to annexing the West Bank than it is to ceding to Palestinian sovereignty over it. And that's not a kind of composition, a structure that can be changed overnight or in a single election. I mean, this is decades in the making. It's structural. Again, hundreds of thousands of settlers, the settlements, over 200 settlements throughout the West Bank that are fully integrated into the rest of the state through infrastructure, through road networks and everything else. And the psychological and emotional attachment that's been fostered by the state over time, in which, if you look at a map since the 1970s that's been produced by Israel, there's no green line carving out the West Bank. The entire territory is seen as itself. There's also a legal architecture that's been put in place for annexation, and that would have to be rolled back. In fact, I mean, if you look at a 2014 basic law that was passed in Israel, which is, has constitutional standing in the country, you can't move back from 1 inch of territory in which Israel applies its law without a supermajority of 80 Knesset members. For the last 4 elections, we've been unable barely to reach 60 Knesset members, but you're going to get 80 to roll back from territory, or a public referendum. That's what it establishes, which is needed. And at the same time, if we look at the differences between when the two-state window was open and when the peace process started in the 1990s, we are so far removed from when that may have been possible. We're not even sure it was really possible to implement, but it may have been possible. The Israeli left is at the weakest point in its history. The peace movement, which was once vibrant in Israel in the 1990s, has been eviscerated. If you look at Israeli political discourse, if you listen to it, peace is a dirty word. It's a dirty word to be used in the political discourse in Israel. I mean, who is advocating for a two-state solution today? Who is putting and applying pressure internally in Israeli politics? Meretz? I mean, I dare say, much to how uncomfortable this makes us, but the Kahanists, the most racist and bigoted in Israeli politics today, hold much more clout in Israeli politics today than Meretz, unfortunately. I mean, I just saw something happen a few days ago in which, well, first of all, you had the flag march in Israel, and everybody, I'm sure, saw that, in which, the kind of racism that was going on, was fully allowed, but then a contingent of people that wanted, on the left, that wanted to go, dismantle an illegal outpost, were stopped by the police and prevented from going there and not allowed to do anything. So you see the difference in terms of state backing. And also a brigadier general recently said, the settlers and the army are one and the same, and anybody that tries to distinguish them, it shouldn't be doing that. But anyway, I think more importantly also in terms of structure, when you're talking about voters, when you're talking about politicians, you think in terms of a cost-benefit calculus that people make. And as my colleague, Dr. Samih said, the status quo is so comfortable for Israelis. They don't feel the occupation. So why on earth would they make decisions to venture into this unknown territory where you're dismantling this whole thing and you're pulling out of the West Bank and you're creating a Palestinian state for Palestinians that have been, dehumanized and made to feel like the boogeyman, and that this state is going to turn into a Hamasistan and they're going to attack you with rockets immediately? Why would you ever take that step when the current status quo is? And that's not even speaking about democratically elected officials. No democratic elected official anywhere takes risky, unpopular, long-term steps when the immediate steps are easy, safe, politically popular, you don't have to do anything. Who does that? And I don't hold Israelis to a different standard when they're electing their officials and how elected officials act. So and if you listen to very serious analysts in Israel, they say that if they took that step to dismantle and pull back hundreds of thousands of settlers, you could spark a civil war in Israel. You could create fissures in the army, based on how I said what that general said, and I take that very seriously. But at the same time, I don't even see it getting to that point, because no government can stay in power long enough to actually say we're going to pull out of the West Bank and implement it. The Israeli political system is not like the U.S. one. You're not elected and then given a 4-year mandate to rule. It's much more fragile than that. And you can just look at the current government, which is, this unwieldy coalition government. It took 4 elections to get there. They have 60 Knesset members. They lost one already. They lost another, but got her back. So, it's about to collapse. It hasn't even done anything. It hasn't done anything. It's walking on eggshells not to do any policy. You're telling me a government's going to get elected that's going to pull back the settlements, pull back 50 years of investment, uproot, break up communities that have been there for an established period of time, break the bonds, religious and emotional bonds to Judea and Samaria and all this kind of stuff. It's impossible. So I think it's a bit of a pipe dream. And Israeli politicians are open about it today. If you listen to Naftali Bennett, he says there will never be a Palestinian state on my watch. If you listen to Netanyahu before him, he said the same thing. So they're very open and blunt about it today. So who's calling for 2 states within Israel, and who's planning on implementing it? You would need an equally monumental shift in the socio-political makeup, and that's nowhere on the horizon as far as I can see. I mean, when we talk about the youth being a game changer, it's very optimistic, because when you read the polling, and I read the polling, the youth are more radical actually than their parents and their grandparents on the Israeli side. And I'm not even broaching, the absolute dysfunction in Palestinian politics at the moment, and the current leadership, which has no credibility whatsoever with its own public. So how can you represent your public at the negotiation table when you have, you haven't been elected in 14 years, you have no credibility, you have no legitimacy. So and public opinion is against you, especially again when we're talking about the youth more than ever is either pro one state or just, is moving in a completely different direction. The Oslo generation has no faith whatsoever in the political project that was implemented by the people that came before them. Anyway, I can go on and on why 2 states is not possible. I'd just like to say one thing more in that regard, though. The loss of 2 states, the loss of partition as an option, is an absolute game changer, I think, in every aspect of this conflict, and it touches everybody that's involved in it. It changes the relationship of Palestinians in the occupied territories to the state of Israel. It changes the relationship of Palestinian citizens of Israel to the state and Israeli society. It changes the relationship of Palestinians across the Green Line to each other. It puts pressure on Israel's own self-identification as being both Jewish and democratic, and forces them, in some regard, to have to choose between the two. And with the Israeli right wing in power, for as long as it's been in power, they're actually open about it, and they say that first and foremost, Israel is a Jewish state, more than a democratic state. And you see the manifestations of that in stuff like the nation-state bill, right, which never mentions democracy. It never mentions equality. What it mentions is this state belongs to the Jewish people. We are the only people with the right to self-determination in the state. So it puts pressure on that self-identification. Again, it upends 25 years of state building and the project of the Palestinian national movement, and we'll see what the consequences of that ultimately are within the Palestinian national movement, within Palestinian politics. But, and again, it changes the status of what Israel is doing in the West Bank. Is it occupation anymore? If we have permanent rule. So again, the effects are tremendous, they're transformational, and they're already taking shape. It's not up to us to say, well, the 2 states no longer is going to happen, and then suddenly all the effects happen. They've been happening for many years. They're taking shape. It's something I've been personally studying and writing about for a while. So no 2-state solution. What's the alternative? Well, the first alternative, again, is permanent Israeli rule over millions of stateless Palestinians. And so that's the establishment of, a single ethno-national state and the denial of self-determination to millions of people. And that's what currently exists, and that's why we're hearing the resonance and the growing narrative of the apartheid narrative, because that's what it looks like, and that's, from the legal standpoint and the human rights standpoint, that's why all these groups are coming to that conclusion. But that's, again, morally unjustifiable. It perpetuates conflict indefinitely. So there's, a one-state option as well, which is, straightforward. It's conceptually clear. It's based on universal values. We're in the United States of America. We understand what one man, one vote looks like, a secular state. So we can appreciate that. In my paper on Confederation, I actually argue against the one-state option for a lot of reasons that I can't get into in here, but if anybody wants to ask about it. So I look at the Confederate model, and there's a lot I can say about it, but what I envisage essentially is two states that are demarcated into their own separate borders, Jerusalem as a shared capital, and they come together to create a layer of institutions that cover various spheres of life, and that can be anywhere from tourism, trade and commerce, transportation, environmental, water rights, and all that kind of stuff. But they come together to form this layer with areas of joint sovereignty. But the bulk of sovereignty rests with the individual states. And those states, again, they have their own institutions, and they're free to cultivate their own their own national rights and all that kind of stuff. And maintain their group identities, their collective self-determination, their national institutions, their schools, their curricula, et cetera, et cetera. The two concepts that I see at the bare minimum that need to be in place to really make this work are open or soft borders and permanent residency, essentially. A system of permanent residency that allows people to live and work and settle. And so essentially what you're doing is you're decoupling political and voting rights from economic, social, residential, and property rights. And again, Jews can go live in the Palestinian state and live and work and worship and do whatever there. Palestinians can do the same, as long as everything's based on parity and reciprocity. And what this results in is a framework, I think, that's much more responsive to the needs and aspirations of both people. It preserves the territorial integrity of the entire country. It keeps the entire country accessible to everybody. It preserves freedom of movement, so everybody can move everywhere. It allows, again, for national self-determination, expression, and development of the unique national identities. And it creates a basis for a common civic identity, which currently does not exist at all. But you're separating, but you're creating at least a layer in which you can start to work together and build some kind of momentum. And again, the biggest advantage, I think, for this model is, one, it's inherently flexible, so it allows the parties to approach the intractable issues that have stopped them at the negotiation table, Jerusalem, refugee settlements, et cetera, in ways that they couldn't before, and it reduces zero-sum competition. And I'll give one example of that before I have to stop. So when you draw a border in negotiations, you're creating winners and losers, basically. Or you're creating actually losers on both sides, because this side is mine and that side is yours, and I no longer have access to that side, and you no longer have access to my side. And so, when one side at the negotiation table is extra powerful and the other side is weak, the strong side never wants to give up its access to everything and draw that border, because it's going to lose, right? And so nothing can ever get done. What you're doing here is you're saying, well, I'm going to draw a border, and this side is mine and that side is yours, but you have rights through this institution, through institutional structures on the other side of the border, and I have rights on your side of the border. And so where we draw the border ultimately is less important, because I have rights on that side and I can access it and do whatever I want, and you can access on my side. And you can apply the same system to Jerusalem, to the refugees. It really helps to resolve, to a large extent, the refugee issue, the settlement issue. And so that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. So finally, I'm going to turn to Laura. Then we'll have a brief discussion. I've got a couple follow-up questions, and we'll take questions from the audience. But Laura, I'm going to ask you to build on anything you've heard so far. What if we are in a post-two-state world? Where are we going? What does it mean? And what are we not wrestling with that we need to be wrestling with?
Thank you, and thank you for having me on this panel. And I guess part of me wants to apologize to everyone here for having to sit through yet another panel about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's a whole region and many things, and yet we always seem to get center stage in conferences, and that reflects the fact that this obviously is bigger than just the Israel-Palestine issue. Where I want to start here, and I want to pick up on something that Gilad said, the old sweater that you mentioned, the old sweater in the back of the closet. I usually talk about a threadbare cloak. And the question of whether the two-state solution is dead or alive, I mean, it's not an animal, it's not a person, it's an idea. And it's clearly very much alive in the public discourse, in the policy discourse. But to what end? It's not in the closet. I monitor Capitol Hill and the administration in Washington every day, and it is very much alive in the discourse. It's the cloak that people wrap around themselves when they want to signal virtue when talking about this issue, but not actually have to take difficult positions. It's the issue that's brought up to discredit Palestinians who want to talk about different ideas or challenge the current paradigm. It is the argument that is brought up to undermine the ability of Palestinians to pursue their rights in any construct except the peace process construct. When the Palestinians go to the UN for any modicum of recognition, they're told it undermines the two-state solution. They're told that by the United States. That's claimed by an Israeli government that's actively working to take the two-state solution permanently off the table through settlements. But when the Palestinians say, well, recognize us at the UN, they say, you're harming the two-state solution. That's the argument for why forget boycotting Israel. People say, that's absolutely anti-two states. That's anti-Semitism. That's discrediting Israel as a state. Just boycotting settlements. You're told, well, that's anti-two-state solution. It discriminates against the Jewish states. It discriminates against Jewish citizens. That hurts the possibility of peace via a two-state solution. Really, anything the Palestinians do that is outside of waiting to come back to the table, well, you're hurting the chances of peace because you can only have peace via a two-state solution. So this framework is very much alive. But I would argue if you look at the past 25 years, it's alive mainly as a paradigm to handcuff Palestinians to a table where there isn't another side necessarily across the table, or that other side may or may not be acting in good faith, but there's no possibility for actually achieving much. So in that sense, it's very much alive. Another way to look at it is, I was talking to my husband about this morning. He said, well, kind of like Schrodinger's cat, is it alive or dead? Well, it's Schrodinger's solution. Is the solution alive or dead, or is there even a solution in the box at all? Was there ever a solution inside the box? I started working on this issue. I joined the Foreign Service in 1992, and I went to Jerusalem on my first tour, so I cut my teeth on this. And I will say, and I certainly, my colleagues, I think, can say as well, that in 1993, there was there was a solution in the box, right? There was good faith, there was good intentions. 25, 30 years later, is there anything in that box at all anymore? When I hear people talk about how you get back on a path to a two-state solution, I still hear things like confidence-building measures. That box relies on confidence-building measures. The idea that you're going to get to peace by the Palestinians demonstrating to Israelis that they deserve peace and are credible, that may make perfect sense to an audience in the international community. For Palestinians, that's a joke. What are those confidence-building measures? And if Israeli confidence-building measures means a modicum of respect for Palestinian humanitarian needs, there's always a readiness to talk about Palestinians as a humanitarian issue, but not actually to solve it. If that's what's in the box, that's not a peace solution, right? Interim steps. There's actually an entire lexicon right now, a taxonomy of terms that no longer have been stripped of meaning. Interim steps, transitional steps, CBMs, and my all-time favorite, constructive ambiguity, which is a term that really needs to be examined carefully. So, what is in the box matters. When people talk about what the way forward is, and particularly about youth, I'm struck. In my current role, I spend a lot of time giving a platform to Palestinian voices, and also Israeli voices, but Israeli voices get plenty of platform. I spend a lot more time trying to give a platform to Palestinian voices, and particularly Palestinian younger voices. And I look at the polls. And I don't think Palestinian or Israeli youth are particularly more radical when they look at the solution for Israel-Palestine than their parents. I think they're incredibly rational and logical. But that doesn't mean that they're, what do I mean by that? To be clear. A new Israeli generation, the post-Oslo generation, several generations, look at the current situation and say, we have nothing to gain by making the compromises for a two-state solution or peace. We're getting it all. We don't need to gain. Why should we take those risks? And they're right. They're absolutely right. If you look at U.S. policy for the past more than a decade, it doesn't matter what Israel does to challenge the two-state solution. There are entitlements now built into the U.S.-Israel relationship, and there's a constantly escalating system of incentives which seem disconnected from what Israel does. The current administration is President Biden is about to go to Israel for the first time as president, and in the past few weeks we have seen an avalanche of new Israeli moves that almost seem deliberately, I don't want to say deliberately timed to discredit him, but my goodness, yesterday they put E1 back on the table, right? I mean, it's hard to think how you could really embarrass a president more than putting E1 back on the table. And the U.S. response has basically been to make clear we will never reopen the consulate in Jerusalem, but Hadi Amar is going to be elevated to an envoy without power. I love Hadi, but that's what his role is going to be. It's an envoy to Palestinians to talk about, economics, humanitarian needs. I mean, this is it. So Israelis, a generation that says we have nothing to gain from making peace, are not irrational or radical, they're rational. And in parallel, if you listen to younger generations of Palestinians, it's not that they're more radical in hating Israel or anti-Semitic. They're more radical in saying, we have nothing to lose by giving up on the two-state solution. Our parents gave up on 78% of historic Palestine, and we are more diminished, more marginalized, more humiliated. Our situation is worse today than it was when Oslo started. We have nothing to gain by holding on to this and nothing to lose by pushing for more. Which really takes me to my last point, and Dr. Brownlee, who's not here anymore, but I want to reference him. Do Palestinians have rights? Do they have rights outside of a peace process framework? That really is the question. And if you listen to Palestinians on the ground today, particularly younger Palestinians, but not only them, that is the question they are asking. The entire peace process paradigm is predicated on the need to somehow deal with the Palestinians in a way that allows Israel to get what it wants and say the Palestinians got enough. And here I always think, in 2000, I think it was 2000, I was at an event with the then ambassador from Egypt to Washington, Nabil Fahmy, became the future foreign minister, and he was talking about why the Egypt-Israel peace agreement succeeded. And at the time he was talking about why no matter how bad it looked on Israel-Palestine, things couldn't be rolled back so far to pre-Oslo. And his argument for why Egypt-Israel peace succeeded was that it was based on a balance of interest, not a balance of power, right? That doesn't seem to be the case for the past 25 years in how Israel-Palestine has worked. And when we talk about two states, when we talk about the future of negotiations, we still seem to talk about it as if there is a balance of power at play. There isn't a balance of power. If there's ever going to be a solution here, it's going to be based on a balance of interests, whether that requires the U.S., the international community weigh in, whatever it is. But that's not where we are today. So I come back to Dr. Brownlee. Do Palestinians have rights if there isn't a two-state construct, if there isn't a peace process construct? We have had 25, 30 years of peace processing that asked Palestinians to accept the idea that they don't, that their rights are contingent upon accepting a paradigm, and the realization of their rights is dependent on the successful completion of that paradigm. I would argue that you now have multiple generations of Palestinians who say, hell no, we don't accept that. And we recognize that staying in that is a trap. And I would argue that they are coming to that realization, or they've come to that realization in a moment in history when you have what would have been called the developing world, the third world. There is a realization around the world that the disparity in power puts people who are seeking their rights in a position that if they allow the pursuit of rights to be dictated by those who have an interest in giving their own rights priority, that they will never have rights. So in that context, I would actually say the two-state, dead alive, it's irrelevant. Two-state, one state, 13 states. Today, if you listen to Palestinians on the ground, and not just in Palestine, we're speaking in this conference as if Palestine is just the West Bank and Gaza. Or maybe, if we're being really generous, the West Bank, Gaza, with some concern for Palestinians inside the Green Line. That isn't how the Palestinian people, by and large, are operating today. Israel's erasure of the Green Line over the past 25, 30 years, and discrediting of the idea of partition, which was always very challenging for Palestinians. It was always, at best, a least worst situation for Palestinians, a least worst solution. What it has achieved is that today you have in a sense, it's remarkably parallel. This is where I'll end. On the Israeli side, years ago, I was walking around Jerusalem with Danny Seideman, who's the Israeli expert on geopolitical Jerusalem, and he was explaining what was happening in Jerusalem and settlements by saying, look, the settlers aren't trying to finish 67, they're trying to finish 48. As far as they're concerned, 48 was incomplete. This is when you hear the group, the Israel Victory Project in Israel. This is now very mainstream in Israel, right? It's establishing full sovereignty over all of Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. It's finishing the job that should have been finished in 48. In parallel, the end of the partition idea as being credible on the ground, the end of the idea that a diplomatic process would get Palestinians' rights, you're now dealing with 48 as well on the Palestinian side. And that doesn't stop at the Green Line, and it doesn't even stop inside the Green Line. It's now the diaspora and all. And that's a very challenging place, I think, for people who have comfortably wrapped themselves in the cloak of the two-state solution for many, many years. And it doesn't suggest any obvious solutions, except to come back to Dr. Brownlee's comment, which is, do Palestinians have rights? Does international law matter? And you know, I said I would stop, I'll say one. I think Israel-Palestine is maybe the place where that gets tested. Does international law matter? Do rights matter? And if they don't matter here, and people is too politically and historically inconvenient, it's not for nothing that we're seeing international law and the whole idea of human rights and civil rights challenged around the globe today.
Thank you, Laura. Gilad had the bad luck of going first, so I want to give him a chance to, one, respond to everything you've heard, but two, touch on some of these questions that have been raised. So even in your own remarks, you mentioned three spoilers. You mentioned leadership, security, and public opinion. If all three of those are three pretty big spoilers. If you don't have the leadership interested, if public opinion is against it, and security remains an issue, how do you overcome those questions? And even my second question would be, one of the premises here is, and you said it in your remarks, that the best solution, or the only solution, I think you said, is a two-state solution. But the premise of that is that there is a solution, that some conflicts don't get resolved. So if we take what has been said by a couple of our colleagues here, and there's not a resolution to this conflict that anyone is interested in, where is that taking us? Gilad.
Okay, I have two comments to Lara and about a dozen to Omar. I'll do it very quickly. First, just to note, a reminder that when President Carter brokered the 1978 framework agreement between Israel and Egypt, the first agreement between Israel and Egypt, there were two, one a year later, the autonomy and the final status of the Palestinians was the first and the central chapter out of two in this agreement. And 15 years later, in Oslo, there was almost an identical process and an identical set of parameters that the architecture of Oslo was built, or I would say piggybacked on the 1978 agreement between Israel and Egypt in order to start moving towards a sovereign Palestinian entity that would be differentiated from Israel and a separate autonomous entity. So what I advocate is actually to impose a gradual process on the parties to resolve the conflict in a manner that I described before. So this is my first comment, and I'll come back to that immediately. Now, when you talk about the Palestinians living within the Green Line, you talk about Israeli Arabs that are citizens with equal rights within Israel. And when you ask the second question, not the first one, how do you identify yourself as a human being, as an Israeli, as a Palestinian, as a Muslim or Christian, or whatever, you ask the second question, Let's assume that there are two states, Israel and Palestine. Where are you going to live? Where do you want to live? I never heard one person replying, even those in villages that are cut into two by the security fence or whatever, one that would say, I want to live in Palestine. They all want to they identify with the state of Israel, despite the fact that Israel is the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, and they know that they are a minority of about 20-21% within Israel. They want to live in Israel, not in Palestine. So their adherence to the Palestinian cause is a little bit limited, more than we would like to think. Now, I'd like to put some records straight in talking about several issues that were raised here by my fellow panelists. First of all, territory and settlements were never the sticking point in the negotiation, in any of the negotiation rounds that I've participated or that I've studied and researched. The main sticking point is Jerusalem, and you cannot possibly bypass the issue of Jerusalem. Not as the shared capital is something that is or is a unified capital for two nation states or in a confederation. This does not hold any water in it. The core issues cannot be bypassed by just a framework of federation or confederation, or call it whatever you want. You first have to draw a borderline between Israel and Palestine. Then you can do whatever you want. Confederation is very welcome, but only after you resolve the core contentious issues that lie in the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The question is just when do you put this kind of platform or idea of confederation? And the timing, the sequencing is, in my opinion, after you draw a border and you are negotiating the resolution of the core issues. The question of the settlers, let me just put it, give you the correct figures here. You don't have to uproot hundreds of thousands of settlers. You will have to uproot or find a solution, an adequate solution that would be acceptable to the other party. You'll have to uproot up to 100,000 settlers. This is not a small number, but it's not a huge number. And this was done in millions in the 90s when Israel absorbed more than 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union in less than a decade. So it could be done. It's in the hands of any Israeli government. And by the way, when there was a commission of inquiry on the disengagement from Gaza, this was actually one of the main recommendations to any prime minister. You have to plan and do it thoroughly, and now, not wait for an agreement or a disengagement, a next disengagement, a unilateral, whatever, but you have to plan how to absorb, how to uproot, how to compensate 100,000 people. This is a written recommendation from 2010 or whatever. Most of the settlers, the vast majority of them, 75%, live in the blocks of settlement in adjacent to the Green Line, to the June 1967 line. So they will be in any way within the borders of Israel. They will be annexed to Israel in consideration for a swap of land from Israel proper to the Palestinian state, in equal in size and in quality. Israel did not annex. My next point is Israel did not annex when all the stars were aligned towards annexation in summer 2020. Under the Trump administration, and Netanyahu as the flagship of annexation did not move an inch. Not then, and it will not move in the future. The Israeli-Palestinian issue, by the way, was never on the table in any of the recent 4 election campaigns in Israel, general elections in Israel. I'm not advocating the two-state solution just for the sake of advocating it. I'm advocating it because I'm concerned with Israel being the single only nation state of the Jewish people. I want it to be kept democratic and liberal and secure and progressive. But I don't want to have to deal with a minority that is a majority of non-Jews within the Israeli borders. I want them to encompass democracy and a Jewish majority. Now, last but not least, you can say, well, it's too late. We've been discussing two states for the last 20 years. Look where we are, etc. Let me tell you this: time is always ripe to do the right thing. It's never too late. And to reply to your question, Robert, I've heard a lot of why not, why do something else. Well, I did not hear any constructive solution to the situation except for let's get our act together and gradually reverse the trend or the direction of the slope, which is a very slippery slope towards a one-state solution, a disastrous one-state, not even a solution, but outcome. Let's gradually reverse the direction of this slope towards a two-state solution that will ensure the future of Israel as a nation-state of the Jewish people and Palestine as the nation-state of the Palestinian people. And when you move towards a solution like that, then you ensure that security along the way is kept. You ensure that the public opinion is addressed in all the modern means of doing so, and you ensure that the people on the ground are little by little seeing the change that comes with the implementation of attainable milestones over time. Great.
Thank you, Gilad. So I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. What I'm going to do, we can respond to each other, I think, in the next session. Let's call for 3 questions, then we'll come back to our audience here, there, and there, and then we'll get in the next one.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. So both Gilad and Samih mentioned that the Abraham Accords could provide some sort of framework to perhaps revive the Arab Peace Initiative. And you, Gilad, you talked about a regional context. I'm just curious, what would that look like?
Okay. Thank you. So we're going to go here, you, sir, and then yep.
In light of the recent $10 billion trade agreement between Israel and the UAE, in your opinion, does this make a fair and equitable Palestinian peace more or less likely as Israel continues, or Israel and its neighbors continue to reach economic agreements?
Thank you. And then I think gentleman in the back, and then we'll come back here, quick responses, one more round, and respond again.
I have 3 quick questions. One is, what do you think the role of the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 had on the acceptability of a two-state solution? Number 2, what role does Iran play in the possible success of this two-state solution? And number 3, when you talk about risk, are you talking about like maybe losing 10% of your money, or are you talking about an existential risk to a country?
Thank you. So we're going to come back to the panel. I'm going to start with Sami to respond to the other panelists, but as well, I think it's important to have a Palestinian voice on these questions of how the Abraham Accords undermine or could support an Israeli-Palestinian peace.
Thank you. But let me make one point before I answer those questions. You know, when you talk about whether Palestinians have right or do they exist or all of that, of course we exist. We are demanding three major things that is in our mind, and we will never give it up. We want our freedom, which means end of occupation, and we want our dignity like any other human being in the world, and we want a better future for our children and grandchildren. That is the main issue. So when we talk about other issues related to two state, one state, or others, no, we want our state, we want our dignity, we want our freedom, and we want to control our life. We cannot live under the control of others. They have no rights to control our life. They control the water that we drink, electricity that we have, our land. And when you talk about annexation, it's an admission that this land is not yours because you want to annex it. You cannot annex something belong to you, right? And at the same time, these days, who are talking to the authority is the defense minister, which means they are saying that they are the occupier. They are occupying us. The defense minister, he's talking to our leadership. Is not Bennett as a politician or not Labid. Only the military, because we are under military occupation. So the only solution for this is the two-state solution. And evacuation of settlement, it happened before. It happened in Sinai, and it happened in Gaza, and it happened in the West Bank, by the way. When Sharon decided to evacuate some of the settlements in Gaza, he evacuated 3 sites in the West Bank, which was never implemented. That's all. So please, when we talk about this issue, there is more than the human rights of the people. They have the rights to be free, they have the right to have their own dignity, and they have the rights to have a better future for their children and others. Of course, the Arab Peace Initiative was one of the greatest offer that was made by all the Arab countries and others. Now, the Abraham Accord trying to, using the power of the State of Israel. We do not deny that the asymmetry between us and them is very wide. I mean, they have the support of the United States all over what they do. They have support of the international community as well, even though everybody's talking about the two-state solution, even this administration. Even Trump, he was talking about some sort of a two-state solution. If you look at the EU, they talk about the two-state solution. Everywhere, 140 countries in the world, they recognize the state of Palestine in the UN General Assembly. What we need, a real recognition, so the state can act as a state. They build their institution as a state, and they will demolish not any other things. The Arab Peace Initiative is important for us. It's not only the $10 billion that they exchange with the Emirates. I mean, Israel, they exchanged $10 billion with China and other countries, selling them military weapons and others. So that's one thing that came recently. The Abraham Accord was a few months ago, last year. So it was only materialized now. And in my opinion, this is fragile, the whole Abraham Accords, because maybe Morocco, the benefit of the Sahara there, that was good benefit from there. But the support of the Moroccan people to the Palestinian cause is more than anybody else in the region. They support the cause of the Palestinians.
Thank you, Sami.
About the 200, what else, the other third question?
It was about sort of risk analysis, I think, on the Israeli side. So we'll save that for Gilad. But I want to give Omar and Lara a chance to respond to anything we've done so far, or we can take another question that may be directed straight to you. Omar, anything you want to talk?
Sure. I mean, there were a lot of comments directed at me by my colleague over here. And I can't respond to all of them. I mean, at the end of the day, I wasn't trying to get into the fine points of what would make a two-state solution viable in terms of 1% land swap versus 2% land swap, or 100,000 settlers versus 150,000 settlers removed from the thing. What I'm saying is that there's not only no political will, there's no political interest whatsoever. I mean, the interest is in the opposite. The interest is in continuing to take the land, settle the land, and not address the political rights of Palestinians and not address the right to self-determination of Palestinians. That's, I think, what's clear. And what I didn't hear from Gilad is, how do you get to the negotiation table? How do you get that political will and political interest in a solution that recognizes those things, that will bring a Palestinian state to existence? And it's interesting what we can say about the Trump plan and the map that was created and stuff like that. And I've said this in multiple talks from the very beginning. The Trump plan is a disaster if you read it. But what it is, though, is a reflection of the reality that Israel has imposed on the ground. It's a reflection of the reality Israel's imposed on the ground. It's Palestinians crowded into 167 mini cantons in the West Bank that are connected by this disparate infrastructure that will remain under Israeli control. Ad nauseum, that's what it essentially is. And even then, to get to that point, because of who wrote the Trump peace plan, to get to that point, Palestinians have to go through 15 different hoops that have to be approved to the satisfaction of Israel just to get to that point. And Israel, before the Palestinians, whether they accept it or not, can start annexing the territory. That's what it says. So, what are we even discussing here in terms of a two-state solution, what it looks like, and how we get to that table? Anyway, regarding the Abraham Accords, it seems to be the hottest topic. We talk about it a lot. In terms of will it revive the API, and we can put the FTA agreement, the free trade agreement, FTA agreement, bulk them together. What I always say on this from the beginning is that the parties that signed these accords had no interest really in the Palestinian side of things. We weren't looking at it. These were driven by national interests from both sides, but mainly, especially from the Gulf side, driven by the national interest. There was some rhetoric around the Palestinians, some lip service paid to the Palestinians, but ultimately this was about addressing certain national interests and geostrategic interests in the region. And therefore, I don't think there's any political will on behalf of, let's say, the Gulf states to push for Palestinian rights and to expend political will vis-a-vis Israel to make these rights serve Palestinian interests at all. And in that regard, then I don't think it's going to happen. And the Palestinians, at least this leadership among the Palestinians handled the whole situation, the regional development, very poorly from my point of view. Kind of mishandled it. They don't really know what they're doing in any regard whatsoever. So, I don't think they're going to make it serve their interests either. Not that it couldn't. I mean, I think any development, it definitely is against the Palestinians to a certain extent, but, in some ways it's like technology. It's agnostic to a certain extent. And can you seize the political advantage? Can you see the political advantage, first of all, and then can you seize it and try to leverage it to work to your advantage? Sometimes you can do that, even in something that's ostensibly very negative. But this group of Palestinian leaders, that's or I heard them described recently by Palestinian activists as not Palestinian leaders but Palestinian rulers, and I think that's more apt, is incapable of that.
Great, thank you, Omar. Go to Laura.
Yeah, just the Abraham Accords clearly were not intended to be helpful to the Palestinians. From the Israeli perspective, they were intended to do exactly the opposite. From the perspective of the Abraham Accord partner countries, these were fundamentally transactional, right? I mean, the big challenge, the Biden administration would very much like to claim credit for expanding the Abraham Accords. That's really going to depend on the transactional piece of it. The Trump administration was willing to pay a very high cost in terms of U.S. actions, recognition of the Western Sahara, arms deals, the like. It isn't clear what is or isn't on the list of things that the Biden administration is willing to pay, particularly when you think about like Saudi Arabia, as we're desperately working to try to get an Iran nuclear deal back in play. It's not really clear how you'd get that transactional piece of it in place. But I think it's worth remembering that the countries that made these transactional deals, A, none of them were actually in a state of conflict with Israel to begin with. That's important. And B, none of them were actually doing anything to really help the Palestinians in the first place, except not normalizing with Israel. right? So it would actually be asking for a shift in their approach to now do something constructive that would help the Palestinians. And I think that's hard to see, particularly so long, and here I'm going to go back to the comfortable cloak of the two-state solution, so long as they can just wrap themselves in the language of supporting peace in two states, but really not have to do anything else. And I want to reference some of the comments that Gilad made. And I mean, I don't want to get into the minutiae of settlements. I did the settlement portfolio at the State Department for a couple of years. I'm really painfully familiar with the details. You know, it is true that there are ways to draw maps where you only have to remove 100,000 or so settlers. But I'd like to note that not all settlers are created equal. The settlers you'd have to remove are the ones that are the most reluctant to be removed, to put it kindly. They're the ones who are the most ideologically committed to the exercise of Jewish self-determination and sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, and arguably the ones that have the contingent within them that is most likely to reject being removed. So it isn't quite so simple. Semi pointed out that under disengagement from Gaza, you actually did have a few settlements removed from the West Bank. I would encourage people to look at the news cycle around Homesh, which is one of the settlements that was removed, and which is now the site of an ongoing effort by settlers to resettle it, which has been going on for some years, which now threatens to take down this Israeli government, right? The fate of a site of a former settlement is the issue that right now is challenging the viability of what is already a weak Israeli government. I think to in any way downplay how big these issues are is not necessarily helpful. And in terms of the march of things on the ground, and this goes back to the Abraham Accords and the language of two states or supporting peace that everyone wraps themselves in, you know, I'm old enough to remember the Israeli Supreme Court, I think last month, saying that Israel can go ahead and I'm going to use the term, ethnically cleanse a big chunk of the southern West Bank near Hebron to make it because it was declared a firing zone. It has a whole bunch of Palestinian villages in it. And the Israeli Supreme Court basically decided to reject all of the arguments of the people living in those villages that they have any right to be there. And now, you know, people say, oh, it's just a Supreme Court. They don't have to do it. They ruled they can do it, but they don't have to. And now every day we're seeing the march of home demolitions and evictions in this exact place. We saw, I think a week ago, a declaration of a new massive national nature reserve in the Jordan Valley. The march of de facto annexation continues. And we can still talk about two states because we have an entire contingent of actors, I think many of good faith, I think everyone at this panel is good faith, I think some of less good faith, who will keep talking about the two-state solution as something that is somehow miraculously, infinitely malleable. It can infinitely stretch to accommodate more settlements, and the edges can be reshaped to annex a little bit here and give a little bit there. You know, it is fascinating how much ability this solution has to shift, and yet somehow it's never implementable. So, I mean, the Abraham Accords, yes, sure, it could be a way to move forward for peace. I don't think anyone has the interest in doing so. And I'll say one last thing before you take the microphone away from me. A lot of this comes back to the United States, right? The United States has an ability to affect this as a policy matter. We choose not to. We choose not to. And this is irrespective of the party in the White House. The Biden administration is choosing to not put any pressure on Israel. They're choosing to not seek to leverage relationships in the Gulf. They've got other things on their agenda. I'm happy I'm not president. There's a lot on his plate. But we clearly have a role in this, and we're choosing by not exercising any power to move things in the right direction. You know, I tweeted out yesterday, E1 is back on the agenda. Right? That's the big settlement that people have long said is the death blow to the two-state solution, blah, blah, blah. Okay, it's back on the agenda. If it's taken off the agenda, that's a win for the settlers, because the Biden administration will have to then accept whatever Israel does by saying, well, you already pleased us by taking off the agenda. And if it's not taken off the agenda, it's a win for settlers because the U.S. will not impose consequences. And it demonstrates again that there are no red lines that cannot be crossed with impunity.
Thank you, Laura. So I'm going to very quickly do the lightning round. We're going to take 2 questions, 30 seconds, ends in a question mark, somewhere on this side of the room out of fairness, and then Gilad, I'm going to go to you with the question that was asked previously. So let's go with these two here, Alan and there we go.
Hi, my name is Al Sharif. I'll try to keep this brief. So I find myself leaning towards Mr. Rahman and Ms. Friedman as far as their view in the situation. There are two hurdles. There are one main hurdle to a two-state solution. That's united and credible leadership. You can argue on both sides. We don't have that. The Palestinians don't recognize the PLO as they did back in the day. And Israeli leadership seems to be heavily fragmented, as the current government opposes. The issue of Palestine is that of political territory, or control over political territory. How do you address political control and rights and safety concerns on both sides and develop trust? As a Sudanese, I can walk safely and own land in the land of my fathers. Palestinians have to jump through tremendous hurdles to even own land in Israel. I can walk safely in my land. Shireen Abu Akleh was killed in the land of her fathers, and we don't see more or less any condemnation, any significant condemnation, or a route towards justice on her end.
Can I ask you to reach a question, if you can? Yep.
Yeah, so I'll just focus on my question. How do you address political control and the rights and safety concerns on both sides and develop trust in a two-state solution?
Great, thank you. Last one, Alan, real quick.
Could someone address BDS and whether or not that is having an influence in the situation, either positive or negative?
Is BDS positive or negative?
Sure, how it's affecting. So let's just go down the line here. Semi, you want to quickly touch on anything? Any final thoughts?
BDS is one way of showing our stand against the occupation and against the settlement and against everything that is happening there. The main problem for us, I think, Clara, you mentioned that, is the American policy, is the previous administration since we started in 1995, and they were the gavel holders of the peace process, what they called the peace process. Till now, they did not act in the right way in order to finalize this issue. None of them. And that's why it's given a privilege for Israel to continue doing what they're doing. That's the only thing. If we have a strong leadership that will look at the interest of the region as a whole, the interest of Israel, the interest of the Palestinian, and the interest of the region, and the interest of the United States, then they can make a decision. They can make at least progress toward achieving that. But as long as they stand, they cannot deliver. We heard it from the previous members of the administration who came to Jerusalem, and we met with them, and they said, we are frustrated, we cannot deliver. What do we expect from them? And now, the only thing that Mr. Biden is going there, I think we hear that he's going to give some money for the hospitals in Jerusalem, because they are suffered. They are one of the hospitals, they have more than 200 people are ill in cancer. There is no place for them in Al-Muttala or in Al-Maqasid. And we begged the American for some support to that, and maybe they're saying that he might, give $100 million in order to get those hospitals in the right way. So that's the real problem. I mean, if you look at the what can build the confident building measures that is taking place. May I just look at some public opinion, Palestinian public opinion that is happening recently in 2022. That they said the survey that was done by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in the West Bank and Gaza, a large majority of Palestinians, 72%, support holding elections at the presidential and legislative levels in the near future. When we start the election, or at least they talk about the election, we have 37 different groups they want to go for to be voted, which means the Palestinian people, they need a change. And not only Hamas and Fatah are dominating the whole thing. No, those 37, not only two of them, one for Hamas and one Fatah, but the others are individuals who wanted to be there. And if we can get 20% of them in the Legislative Council, there will be a change. So this is one thing good. Okay, but just to continue this. Another important development supported by 60% of the holding of a special session for the PLO Central Council, in which important decision relevant to Palestinian-Israeli relationship will be taken. 40% remains almost the same as it was last quarter of 2021 for the support of the two-state solution.
Thank you, Sami. So domestic reform being a step forward. Lara, Omar, Gilad, final thoughts, reactions?
Sure. I want to take out the BDS thing, and I want to just spell this out. Trying to protest your rights via boycotts. Trying to protest for your rights by calling for divestment. Supporting a political cause by calling for sanctions against someone you feel is doing something wrong. Israel-Palestine is the only context that I know of in the world where these tactics are considered illegitimate. And in that sense, I think the BDS movement debate around it is amazingly clarifying. And it's not just that these tactics are somehow delegitimized. I was accused of undertaking an act of diplomatic terror against Israel because I spoke before the UN Security Council about settlements. The Israeli government said I committed an act of political terrorism, diplomatic terrorism. I mean, the whole debate around BDS is whether or not, aside from, again, sitting shackled to the two-state solution table where nothing is happening, whether or not Palestinians have the right to seek their rights in any other way, or to seek to defend or challenge Israeli policies in any other way. And the argument against BDS essentially is to say no, and to escalate it further by saying, if you defy that, then you're an anti-Semite. And I say this as someone who spends every single week, I spend time going through the legislatures of every single state in the United States and going through what's happening in Congress. I report this is all on the record, you can see it yourself. In order to insulate Israel from pressure, from boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, and not just insulate Israel, but insulate Israeli settlements, we have a body of legislation in more than half of US states that seeks to target people who boycott Israel or Israeli settlements. And not only that, we have this legislation now being used as a template by illiberal forces that want to block boycotts or other targeting of the guns and ammunition industry, right? Of the oil and gas industry. We're sitting in Texas. Texas has legislation which is modeled on anti-BDS legislation. The people who wrote it say we're modeling on anti-BDS legislation, not me, which basically imposes sanctions on companies that boycott the oil and gas industry or the guns and ammunition industry in ways that are probably unconstitutional, almost certainly in terms of getting contracts for state business and whatnot. That's how far people are willing to go to say it is illegitimate to challenge or protest Israeli policy. Is the problem then BDS and the tactics? Or is the problem that we are in a construct which says, again, this gets back to the subject of the panel. If you're not going to sit shackled to the two states table and wait for something to happen and wait to see if that Schrodinger's box opens and maybe there's a peace framework inside, maybe there isn't, anything else you do is illegitimate. And in order to make sure it is considered illegitimate, we're actually willing to challenge the tactics themselves. And we see this debate around Ukraine, boycott, divestment, sanctions. What is legitimate, what isn't? And if it comes down to it, my guess is we will come out on the US, many in the US, saying, you know what, if it's necessary to protect Israel from pressure, we're going to call it illegitimate to boycott, divest, and sanction there too. Because that's the trajectory we're on. So I think the BDS campaign has been enormously clarifying. And for those who say it's not impactful, I would say the fact that Israel has stood up an entire Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which has now been folded into the Foreign Ministry, so it stood up an entire ministry to push back on it would suggest it's actually quite impactful.
Thank you, Lara. Omar, as quickly as we can.
I'll try. I won't address the topic as much because, I mean, to me, Lara's one of the most articulate speakers on the subject of BDS, and so I'll leave you with her words. I would just add that, and this is overlapping a little bit, but Palestinians are essentially stripped of their right to resist their persecution, in a sense, right? Like any form of resistance, if it's armed resistance, it's terrorism, if it's anything they do, and if it's BDS again, which represents a form of protest that is legitimate in every other context throughout history, nonviolent, it's still considered illegitimate. It's considered racist. It's anti-Semitic. Etc. And it's a bit ridiculous. The only thing that Palestinians are allowed to do is go sit at a negotiating table in which they have absolutely no leverage and talk endlessly and sit there for, it's been 30 years and nothing's happened. So the one thing I would say, and this has to do with my Confederation idea, is that no negotiated solution is possible unless the dynamics change, unless the structure of incentives changes, unless the cost-benefit calculus changes. And the only way to do that is to mobilize pressure on the situation as it exists. And so that applies to everything. And I just wrote a book chapter with Dalia Shenlin, who's one of the the leading pollsters, American Israeli pollsters, on the evolution of support for the two-state solution and how it's it's gone through an arc and now it's going down. And if you look at it, even when it was at its height, if you actually poll Israelis and Palestinians about the details of what that solution looks like, then the polling goes immediately down, the support, because when people hear about the sacrifices that it entails, the polling goes down. When you look at something like Confederation, actually, and you talk about what's actually entailed in it, because the idea is not well known and it's a little bit convoluted, but when you actually poll on the ideas, the support goes up. So, and these are things, one state and Confederation and Federation have not even been elucidated at all in terms of what they actually mean and the ideas spread among the public or any of that kind of thing.
Thank you, Mark. Gilad, final thoughts? We're standing between folks and lunch, so as quickly as we can.
I'm the one standing between you and lunch, so I'll be telegraphic. Speaking about the confidence-building measures instead of real negotiations, this is analogy to prescribing aspirin pill to a dying person. It doesn't help. It doesn't affect the situation. It doesn't change anything on the ground. The BDS, I'm sorry to say, we have, Lara, we have so many redundant ministries, and this one is one of them, that dedicated to the BDS, but it has no practical effect on Israel in whichever dimension you check. I regret to say that it often is anti-Semitism in disguise, because when you ask the BDS protagonists what, I understand what you are against, but what are you for? And what do you suggest? It stops there. It does not evolve to any other place. The Arab Peace Initiative, I believe that should be the general ballpark for a regional context of talks. There's many trade-offs that could be obtained because as much as I know that Jerusalem is not an exclusively Palestinian issue. It's a much wider issue that needs to be negotiated in a larger on a larger platform. And that's how you get to negotiate if you start regionally, bilaterally, and you have some international actors within it. Then you are on track again. The UAE, Morocco, Bahrain peace agreements, the Abraham Accords, they presumably bypassed the Palestinian issue, but it came up again, of course, because even in the conference that we held in the Negev 2 months ago, there was no one participant from those Abraham Accords countries that skipped the issue or neglected the issue of the Palestinian, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it basically what it did, those accords that are very important. There was no conflict. So this is not this is not peace, because these were not fighting or struggling parties from one side and the other side. This was a formalizing of an affair, an extramarital affair, making it kosher after 20 or 30 years of relationship. Whether the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an existential risk or threat, yes, it is. More than nuclear Iran and Iranian proxies, etc., because it creates the internal Israeli tribalism and sectorialism and extremism. You mentioned Kahana. 2 more points. You mentioned Kahana, and it actually legitimizes those kind of racist phenomena. And I believe that this is what pushes Israel towards the end of the third temple, what we call. Finally, my last comment, is the following. All conflicts eventually come to an end. In the last 70 years, there were 60 conflicts around the world that were resolved. And ours is not unique. It's not so special. It is very complicated. It's very complex, very protracted. But we need to make. You need to make us talk to one another. I mean the civil society, the international community, and us ourselves on all the fronts that I mentioned. And I believe that this is the only way to resolve conflict, to talk to one another, and to make sure that what you cannot see from within the conflict, when you suffer, when you are swamped in bloodshed and in terrorism and counter-terrorism and retaliation, etc., you cannot see it. But one day it's over, and you look back and you say, wow, can I breathe now? It's over. And it's like that in every conflict when you compare the resolution of conflicts throughout history. That's the way it is. Conflicts of dozens of years, hundreds of years, come to an end eventually, and ours will come to an end as well.
I want to thank Gilad. I want to thank all 4 of our panelists, as well as the Baker Institute for hosting us, and you, the audience, for being with us. I think we've got lunch, then we're going into the armchair discussion, but thank you all.